Good evening. Is that mic level about right? Yep, okay. I'd like to welcome you to our third presentation in the 2004 Borah Symposium. My name is Sandy McCurdy, and I'm a faculty member at the University of Idaho in the School of Family and Consumer Sciences. I'm also a member of the 2004 Borah Symposium Planning Committee. The Borah Symposium Planning Committee is made up of faculty and students at the University of Idaho. And in fact, if you look on the back of your program, you can see a list of who are the members of the Planning Committee. Since 1948, the Borah Symposium has presented an annual program at the University of Idaho on topics devoted to understanding the causes of war and the conditions for establishing a lasting peace. This year, the topic for the Borah Symposium is strategic nonviolent conflict. If you were to have attended our first two sessions, that is last night and today at noon, you would have heard about the successes of nonviolent conflict strategies in various locations around the world. India, Denmark, the southern United States, Poland, Chile, South Africa, and also in Serbia. Tonight, we're going to hear about the potential for applying this strategy of nonviolent conflict in North Korea. Now, your program says in North Korea and Cuba, and unfortunately, our analyst for Cuba was unable to come this evening, and we were unable to find a suitable replacement. However, one of our speakers will address conditions in Cuba as well. We're fortunate to have with us tonight two experts who can discuss the issue of nonviolent conflict strategies into the situation in North Korea. I'm going to introduce the speakers, and then each of them, and then they will each give about 15 or 20 minutes worth of information from their perspective on this. Then we will open up the floor microphones and have a discussion with the audience about the topic. Our first speaker will be Jack Duvall. This is Jack. He is the president of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict and was the executive producer of the Emmy-nominated PBS television series, A Force More Powerful, A Century of Nonviolent Conflict, and the co-author of its companion book of the same name. He has previously served as Vice President for Program Resources at WETA-TV in Washington, D.C., as Director of Corporate Relations for the University of Chicago, and as the Director of Industry Compliance for the Cost of Living Council in the Executive Office of the President. Our second speaker will be Dr. Daniel A. Pinkston. There's Daniel. Daniel is a senior research associate and Korea specialist at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies in Monterey, California. He has a doctorate in international affairs from the University of California at San Diego and a master's degree in Korean studies from Yonsei University. I probably don't have that pronunciation right. I should have asked.
Yonsei University, that's correct.
Yeah, all right. In Seoul. Dr. Pinkston recently directed the research and production of the North Korea country profile for the Nuclear Threat Initiative. This profile is the most comprehensive, open-source overview and assessment of North Korea's programs to develop weapons of mass destruction and ballistic missiles. He has written on Korean political economy and security issues and is now writing a book on the political economy of Korean missile development. Dr. Pinkston also served as a Korean linguist in the U.S. Air Force, and he has extensive experience in Korean to English translation. Please join me in welcoming these two speakers to the Borah Symposium.
Thank you very much for coming this evening and being willing to listen to us discuss the potential application of the strategic use of mass nonviolent action to seek political change in North Korea and Cuba. Dan and I will focus primarily on North Korea in our remarks, but we want to begin a conversation with all of you about both of these countries as emblematic of the possibilities for the use of nonviolent conflict in places in the world where it has not heretofore been seen. In the course of talking at many colleges and universities and other kinds of venues in the last few years about nonviolent conflict, in my capacity as head of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict and as a producer of the television series A Force More Powerful, I have often been asked, well, these ideas are wonderful, and we're delighted that they worked in places like India and Chile and the Philippines, but they could never work in a place like Stalin's Russia, or they could have never worked in Nazi Germany. And as we think about any authoritarian country, such as that of North Korea, or any one-party single dictator state, as with Cuba, which has remained in place for decade after decade after decade, it is tempting for us to think of such states in the same way that we think historically of Stalinist Russia or Nazi Germany. It doesn't seem as if such maximum repression can be opposed by ordinary civilians. What I would like to do in my conversation with you now is to share with you one story, certain facts about life in North Korea, and some thoughts and ideas about what might be possible in a country like that. And then perhaps in the question period we can discuss the Cuban situation as well. In our book, A Force More Powerful, though not in the television series A Force More Powerful, we examined the continent-wide phenomenon of civilian resistance to German occupation in World War II in Europe. There was not a country occupied by the Germans that did not experience resistance to that occupation. It was, as wherever it needed to be, an extremely brutal occupation. It was no less brutal, potentially, no less repressive for Germans themselves living under Nazi rule. But there is one very extraordinary story, which we tell in our book in just a couple of pages, which may illustrate for you how it is possible, even in a society which to the outside world would appear totally impervious to any kind of civilian action or civilian dissent, how it is possible for such action to take place. So if you'll indulge me for just about 5 minutes, I'd like to read to you this excerpt from our book, A Force More Powerful, about a series of events that took place in Berlin in 1943. On February 27, 1943, SS soldiers and local Gestapo agents began seizing the Jews of Berlin in an operation called the Final Roundup. They were loaded onto trucks and taken to the Jewish community's administration building at Rosenstrasse 24 in the heart of the city. The goal was finally to make the city Judenfree, free of Jews, necessitating the forcible collection of Jews with German spouses and their Mischling, mixed ancestry children. For 2 years, these Jews had escaped the jaws of the Holocaust because they or their German spouses were essential for the war effort, and the regime wanted no unpleasantness on the home front. But the stunning military defeat at Stalingrad earlier that month, February 1943, shattered German morale and led Hitler to call for total war against Jews inside Germany as well as Allied armies. Word spread quickly about these abductions in Berlin, and before long, a group of non-Jewish German women had gathered on the Rosenstrasse with food and other personal items for their Jewish husbands, whom they believed were being held inside that building. One of the women, Charlotte Israel, arrived and found 150 women already huddled outside. She asked one of the guards for her husband's potato ration cards, which he went to get to prove that he was there. On the back of a card, which he brought out, her husband Julius wrote, "I'm fine." Other women began asking for personal effects to confirm that their husbands were inside, and soon after began demanding their release. One woman's brother, a soldier on leave, approached an SS guard and said, "If my brother-in-law is not released, I will not return to the front." The crowds grew considerably despite the winter chill, and soon women waited outside day and night, holding hands, singing songs, and chanting, "Let our husbands go." By the second day of the protest, over 600 women were keeping a vigil on the Rosenstrasse. This was not the first time many of these women had voiced dissent. For over a decade, they and their families had challenged Nazi racial policies through small demonstrations, insisting that the regime would be hurting fellow Germans by persecuting their Jewish spouses. Hitler and his circle had always tried to minimize unrest and avoid the kind of domestic opposition the German rightists saw as the stab in the back that had crippled the German effort during World War I. Until this point, the regime had largely managed to keep the genocide against the Jews a secret. But when it affected a group who were unafraid to speak out against Nazi policies, that secrecy was jeopardized. By the third day, SS troops were given orders to train their guns on the crowd of women, but to fire only warning shots. They did so numerous times, scattering the women to nearby alleyways, but the wives always returned and held their ground. They knew the soldiers would never fire directly at them because they were of German blood. Also, arresting or jailing any of the women would have been the rankest hypocrisy. According to Nazi theories, women were intellectually incapable of political action. So women dissenters were the last thing the Nazis wanted to have other Germans hear about, and turning them into martyrs would have ruined the Nazis' self-considered image as the protector of motherhood. The campaign soon expanded to include women and men who were not in mixed marriages. The ranks of protesters bulged to 1,000, with people chanting to let the prisoners go and taunting SS soldiers. Joseph Goebbels, seeking to stop more from arriving, closed down the nearest streetcar station, but women walked the extra kilometers from another station to reach Rosenstrasse 24. By the end of the week, Goebbels saw no alternative but to release the prisoners. Some 35 Jewish male internees who had already been sent to Auschwitz were ordered to gather their belongings and board a passenger train back to Berlin. Without fully realizing what they had done, the Rosenstrasse women had forced the Nazis to make a choice. They could accede to a limited demand and pay a finite cost, 1,700 prisoners set free if all the intermarried Jewish men were released, or they could open a Pandora's box of protest in the center of the capital and brutalize German women in the bargain. For the Nazis, maintaining social control was more important than making sure every Jew went to the gas chambers. The regime that terrorized a continent found itself unable to use violence against a challenge on its very doorstep. The Nazis were savage, but they were not stupid. As it happened, many more than 35 Jewish men were set free. The protests confronted Nazi officials with an unresolved question: what to do with other intermarried Jews? Goebbels wanted them deported from Berlin so he could tell Hitler the city was free of Jews. Himmler prevented the deportation, but Goebbels lied to Hitler and told him it had happened, and then tried to get Jews still in Berlin to stop wearing their Stars of David. A month later, Adolf Eichmann's deputy in Paris wanted to know what he should do about the French intermarried Jews. On May 21st, Himmler's deputy released them all, everywhere, from the camps. 5 years earlier, Mohandas Gandhi had been asked about the Nazis. He said, "Unarmed men, women, and children offering nonviolent resistance will be a novel experience for them." So that's what happened in Nazi Europe. in 1943. That is not something that has happened very often under such a regime of terror. But that it happened illustrated that what looks to the outside world as if it were completely impossible is not impossible if individuals are motivated, if they feel a rank injustice, and if they take action which goes at a vulnerability or an unwillingness of what is otherwise a very oppressive regime to be repressive at that time and in that place. What I'd like to do now is to give you a little bit of a flavor for what North Koreans have been going through under the regime which governs them. This report is from the London Times of October 26, 2003, and reports the investigations of a veteran human rights activist, David Hawk, who worked in the past in Cambodia and Rwanda, and decided to interview former political prisoners in North Korea. And in these interviews, he took tape testimony from those who had been inside the country and who, for various reasons, were feeling the kind of oppression that existed in North Korea. Let me read just one brief excerpt. A 66-year-old grandmother testified to witnessing the deaths of babies at Sunuju, 2 of them healthy boys born at full term. These were babies born to North Korean women who had fled as refugees to China and then had come back to North Korea. And the presumption was that their babies were Chinese, half Chinese. The first was a child born to a woman called Lim, aged 28. The witness was holding the newborn in a blanket when a guard grabbed him by a leg and threw him into a large box lined with plastic. A doctor explained that since North Korea was short of food, the country should not have to feed the children of foreign fathers, the report quoted her as saying. A total of 7 babies, 5 born prematurely through induction, were left to die in the box. 2 days later, the premature babies were dead, but the 2 full-term boys were still blinking, although their lips had turned blue. A guard battered them to death with forceps. At the Nongpo Center in Chongjin, witnesses saw the children of betrayers, quote unquote, tossed into a wicker basket, covered in plastic sheeting and left to die. One woman watched the killing of 7 babies, taken from their mothers but left face down on the ground within their view. After 2 days, the guards smothered any that were still alive. Guards would say the mothers had to see and hear their babies die because they were Chinese, the report said. January 20th, 2004, a report from Deutsche Press, published in Germany, reporting eyewitness accounts collected by Amnesty International. And this is from a direct quote from that Deutsche Presse article, based on Amnesty International eyewitness reports. Tens of thousands tried to escape North Korea in desperation, a move which frequently made things even worse, as China, for instance, simply sent large numbers of the refugees back. In its report, Amnesty provides the witness account of one man who was sent to a detention camp where, he says, people died in droves precisely from the hunger in North Korea they had been trying to escape. Their food consisted of potato peelings, beans, and watery soup with an odd piece of pumpkin, says this one witness, who added, "We were forced to sit motionless and with our head down from 5 a.m. to 11:30 p.m. The detainees had to clean up each other's feces with bare hands. Nobody was given any soap," he says. A woman identified as Cho by Amnesty was banned to a labor camp after being sent back from China following her escape from North Korea. Pregnant women were forced to work in the brickyard and in the vegetable garden from 5 a.m. to 10 p.m., she reports of her experience. Those who were caught hiding vegetables for themselves were forced to beat each other up, and when they did not hit each other hard enough, the police stepped in and beat them. Meanwhile, the communist regime, this is again the German news report, has been working to keep any news about the camps away from the rest of its citizens and make them believe that the food situation is no better, for instance, at its next-door neighbor and ideological enemy, prosperous South Vietnam. From a report on February 1st of this year, just a month ago, from the Daily Telegraph in London, this is a report based on interviews with a North Korean intelligence agent who defected to the South. Let me just read this one excerpt. He said that he witnessed chemical experiments being carried out on political prisoners in specially constructed chambers hidden in the camp, one of the many labor camps in North Korea. Various different gases, he claimed, are being tested there, including one he called vanilla, related to the North Korean artificial fiber Vinilon. He described the chambers, glass rooms within a room, sealed and with a ventilation shaft that pumps gas inside. Above there is a viewing gallery where North Korean scientists observe the death throes of their victims. This is a quote. The most unforgettable scene I remember was when I watched an entire family being killed. They were put inside the chamber and I saw them all suffocate to death. The last person to die was the youngest son who was crying for his parents and eventually died. That's what North Koreans face. North Koreans who try to escape and come back, North Koreans who, for one reason or another, are part of the gulag of labor camps in that country. It's believed that some 300,000 North Koreans are living in refugee status in China right now. One North Korean was interviewed by the administrator of the Agency for International Development of the U.S., who testified in Senate testimony in January of this year, that when he had gone to China within the past year to go through these areas to interview these North Korean refugees, he was particularly struck by his interview with this one North Korean. One said, and this is a quote from the North Korean, "They've been lying to us all these years. They've been lying to us. We told everybody in the village," meaning this particular refugee had gone back to North Korea and then come out again at which time this interview took place. "We told everybody in the village this is all a lie. We have been told that we are better off, but we're not better off. We were told that China is in the middle of a civil war and a famine. It's not true. It's not true." One of the modern remarkable practitioners of nonviolent action, acting inside a communist regime, is Vaclav Havel, the former president of the Czech Republic and the leader of dissident groups inside Czechoslovakia in the 1980s. In his book, The Power of the Powerless, really a long essay in 1979, probably the finest statement about the theoretical basis for nonviolent action written since Gandhi, he said that in an oppressive or authoritarian society, everyone is essentially asked, whether they are realizing it or not, to live a lie. And the lie is that life is normal. The lie is that conditions can't be improved. The lie is that nothing can be done by any individual, by no civilian, by no ordinary person, in order to change circumstances for the better. Your only choice is to acquiesce in the circumstances that you face. But Havel said that lie cannot be perpetuated, that there is no authoritarian system capable forever of ensuring that lie is believed. And that when people in the society, individual by individual, make the personal decision to stop living in the lie and start living in the truth, when they face themselves in the mirror and realize that their life is miserable, the social and economic conditions that their families are living and working under are intolerable, and that they have no voice in the way in which they are governed, the way in which their society is ordered. The moment that they make that internal decision to stop living in the lie and start living in the truth, and then once a sufficient number of people in that society make that internal decision, Havel said, incalculable, explosive power will be opened up within that society. And what was heretofore thought impossible will then become possible. That is the psychological dynamic that happens on a personal level that is in part what accounts for the decisions of those who decide to begin resistance of some kind. The Rosenstrasse wives felt that this condition of their husbands being taken away was intolerable. They probably didn't know any better than to go down and sit in and protest. They probably didn't have an adequate idea of the risks they may have faced by doing so. They may have been fortunate or lucky that they caught the Nazi regime at a moment and in a place of vulnerability. They were probably not familiar with the political circumstances fully that they faced, but the internal decision was not to accept these conditions. The North Korean regime has a system of classification, which has been in existence for a couple of decades at least, whereby people are identified as to their potential unreliability or their reliability, their loyalty or their potential disloyalty. And at different times, reports would indicate in the last 2 decades, as much of a quarter of the population has been identified by the regime itself as not sufficiently reliable, and whole families who are identified as not reliable for whatever reason the regime might have are those who find their way into the labor camps. The regime itself senses that there are people within the country who are not prepared to believe the lie. And as you heard a few moments ago, once an individual gets out, once an individual has information, once an individual can make a basis for comparison on his own or on her own, they wake up to the lie. And then it becomes that much more difficult for the regime to maintain business as usual. In our work in looking at nonviolent conflicts in the last 100 years, we do not find a predictable correlation between the likelihood of the initiation of nonviolent resistance by ordinary civilians and conditions of repression within the country. There are very repressive regimes which have fallen to a civilian-based struggle, which had its beginnings in those simple decisions by individuals that they would no longer find tolerable the conditions that they faced. And there are, let's be fair, regimes such as the one in Cuba, which is infinitely less repressive than the one in North Korea, where civilian opposition has not been successful. So the mere fact of repression does not by itself control the likelihood or the possibilities for nonviolent resistance in our view. There are different circumstances in each country. But there's no question that the full history of nonviolent action throughout the last 100 years demonstrates that it is a mistake to underestimate the courage and the ingenuity of people who live in these societies, who want to have a say in the way their country is governed, who certainly want a better life. And when a particular regime has persisted for decade after decade, and life does not improve, and conditions even worsen, the readiness to engage in some form of resistance is almost always present, if only in a latent way. How that resistance can be activated, how it can be instructed, so that once it manifests itself, it is effective, is an important question, which we've tried to address in a good deal of our work, and which is essential if any assistance is going to be given to civilians who may be interested in resistance. There are some efforts underway as we speak by at least one South Korean human rights organization, by some other organizations, to try at least to help open up North Korean civilians to information about conditions in the outside world. One effort to drop transistor radios into North Korea. modern technology. By the way, the South Korean government is also this year considering a change in its law. Right now, it is technically illegal for South Koreans to send email to North Korean email addresses for whatever reason, I'm not sure. And there is an effort, I'm told, in the South Korean parliament to try to change that law to open up internet connections between the North and the South. In most cases where there is a closed society and there is a need for or an interest in political liberation, the more you open up communication, the more you bring information to people, the more likely it is that at least hope and encouragement will flow through those communication lines and through that information to provide ordinary civilians in these countries with some encouragement that if in fact they do decide to engage in acts of opposition, that there is a world outside that is willing to be supportive. In the Czech Republic, Vaclav Havel's country, in Prague, in 1989, the students and ordinary residents of Prague and other Czechs, primarily Czechs, some Slovaks, who gathered in Wenceslas Square when no less than 1 million people gathered to demand that the communist regime step down. The students in the front ranks chanted, "The whole world is watching," as it was. And that was a powerful constraint on that regime. The lesson of the Rosenstrasse wives in 1943 in Berlin is even the worst regimes have constraints. And finding those constraints and helping civilians inside these countries understand those constraints so that they can engage in opposition which ultimately gains traction is what we as an organization hope to stimulate around the world, and which we certainly think is possible.
I'd like to thank the University of Idaho and the Borah Foundation for inviting me here. It's been an honor and a pleasure to participate in this symposium. And thank you, Jack, for your very informative talk. A lot of depressing stuff in there. So I'm going to try to be a little bit more upbeat this evening. And in fact, I'm very optimistic about liberal democracy, and I agree that authoritarian regimes are not sustainable. I lived in South Korea from 1985 to 1992, and I was there during the summer of 1987 when South Korea went through a democratization process. So I'm also very confident in the Korean people, including the North Korean people. Nevertheless, I am very disturbed about the human rights violations, the cult of personality in North Korea, the government failure, policy failures in economic development and in other areas. And Jack talked about much of that earlier. So some of the things I'm going to say are maybe counterintuitive. I'm very opposed to some of those disturbing policies. But nevertheless, I try to remain optimistic. And my greatest concern right now is the North Korean nuclear program. I would like to see rapid democratization in North Korea. But I believe in the short term, there are significant collective action problems for the society to force democratization. And in the short term, North Korea is on the verge of deploying a nuclear arsenal. So that is very problematic. Right now, there's a SixParty process, a process of SixParty Talks. In fact, the second round just finished last Saturday in Beijing. Maybe some of you have seen that reported in the press. Now, in my analysis of this, it looks very bleak, but I remain optimistic, and I'm going to tell you why. And in my analysis and working on this problem, I look at it with three assumptions I think that are very plausible. The first is that domestic politics matter, both in, of course, in the U.S. I think everyone accepts that. And the same is true in North Korea, and the same for the other countries in the region. Secondly, I believe it's a case of strategic interaction. Now, what does that mean? Strategic interaction means that more than one party has control over the outcome. No single actor has complete control. Now, some people lose sight of that, or they misunderstand this case. When we look at the United States is this huge superpower, probably the greatest power in the history of humanity. And North Korea is a weak country. So many people believe that gaining compliance or forcing North Korea to abandon its nuclear weapons program is simply a matter of the United States mobilizing its resources and applying pressure to North Korea. But that's incorrect. If, in fact, we fail to reach a negotiated settlement, North Korea can worsen the outcome and have an effect on the outcome that can worsen the security of the United States and the United States allies. So that's a problem that I think needs to be addressed, and many people lose sight of this, including some of our policymakers. And the problem is, if you take that approach, it can never really be falsified, because we look at North Korean behavior, they're not abandoning the program. Critics will argue that, well, we simply have not applied enough pressure. In fact, I'd argue that pressure alone only is encouraging them or forcing them to accelerate the program. Now, this third assumption, this third point, I think is very important, and this is where we have some possible opportunities, and this is where I'm focusing some of my work. And I believe that North Korea and the officials responsible, the decision makers in Pyongyang, who primarily sit on the National Defense Commission, the chairman is Kim Jong-il, they will base their decision, they will make their decision based upon a comprehensive national security strategy. Many people lose sight of that as well. We tend to focus on the nuclear program, and we should, because it's the most threatening thing we face from North Korea. But we have to think about the decision-making calculus in Pyongyang. So how do we get some traction on that? How do we analyze, or how do we understand what their national security strategy is? Yes, North Korea is an opaque system. The politics and the society are very opaque. But when I look at it, I believe that their national security strategy is based on these two concepts, basically. And these were first introduced around 1997, 1998, when Kim Jong-il officially rose to power and formally took over the control of the state after his father had died in 1994. This first concept is called military-first politics. There's a lot of confusion about what that means. A lot of people just believe that's aggressive, belligerent stance. It indicates that North Korea is a revisionist power and willing to use force to overturn the status quo. However, it's a little bit more complicated than that. What it means is that the North Korean military and the Korean Workers' Party are dedicated to maintaining the territorial integrity of the DPRK. It also means that the military will have first cut at resources if necessary to accomplish that task. It also means that the Korean Workers' Party and the leadership will take care of the military, the Korean People's Army, because they are an important component of the ruling coalition. And it's also, in some sense, a rejection of Marxism. This second concept, where they formulate their national security strategies, based on this, it's called Kangsong Daeguk, or building a strong and powerful country. And when you look at the North Korean literature, they claim that strong and powerful countries should be strong and powerful in everything, whether it's sports, science, literature, and on and on and on. But really, when you cut through all of that, they focus on three dimensions, three things. The first is ideology and the political indoctrination of the society. And they believe they're already strong in that area. And that's based upon this concept of juche, or self-reliance, that began in the 1950s under his father. And they believe that the population is strongly indoctrinated with this, and they stand firmly behind the leadership. The second main dimension is the military. And they used to believe they were a strong and powerful country in military terms, but over the past year or so they've begun to question this, particularly after the war in Iraq. They used to say quite often that they had something that was more powerful than nuclear weapons. This caused a lot of confusion in Washington, D.C. and other places. American analysts were confused about that. But what it means is that it's this single-hearted unity behind the leader, and kind of a Maoist concept. Chairman Mao spoke about the same thing back in the late 40s. But with the Bush Doctrine and the United States' willingness to use preemptive military strikes or preventive war, they began to question this abstract concept, and they began to speak about the necessity for a physical deterrent and then later a nuclear deterrent. So they are in this process of rethinking this. And the leadership is, I think, is divided in Pyongyang as well. There are hawks, and there are those that think it's would be prudent to abandon the program, but it's contingent upon what the United States does. Now, this third dimension of this building a strong and powerful country is the economy, and this is very important. This is where I think we have a possible opportunity to resolve this nuclear crisis in a peaceful way. And this is what has fundamentally changed over the last 10 years, and why the crisis is different now than it was back in the early 90s. In 1998, when Kim Jong-il formally rose to power, we later learned that he approved economic reforms. We even have a secret tape. There was a tape recording made of his conversation with someone in the 1980s, and he was criticizing socialist economics. He says it destroys people's incentives to work, and people get lazy, and on and on. So anyway, after the economic free fall from about 1990, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, and when they lost their comrade prices and subsidies from the Soviet Union, they also suffered from famines and natural disasters, floods, and so forth in the mid-1990s. When Kim Jong-il approved these reforms, they recognized that the regime must deliver economic recovery to sustain their regime. However, the economic reforms were delayed because this was right in the wake of the East Asian financial crisis, if you recall. So they were finally implemented in July 2001. And here's where I think there's an opportunity, because to deliver that economic recovery, North Korea believes, and they tell this to North Korean people, that they need foreign direct investment, they need foreign technology transfers, they need to open their economy, they need access to foreign markets, they have to export, and most telling, they devalued their currency and have, for practical purposes, moved to a crawling peg where their value of their currency reflects the value in black markets and so forth, the true value of the currency. And that had huge distributional consequences when you do that. People that had access to foreign exchange, people in the regime, the privileged few, would make windfalls from having this overvalued currency. So this tells me that they're serious about reform. They have lifted price controls, they've delegated price-making authority, and so forth. Now, many people believe that these economic reforms are a failure because there are bottlenecks on the supply side. They haven't got the foreign direct investment, they haven't got the technology transfers. But nevertheless, things have improved over the past couple of years. The economy appears to have bottomed out and is now improving. So North Korea, why would they give up their program? The leadership is facing a number of security problems, both external and internal. Nuclear weapons are not sufficient for solving all of those problems. even the North Korean leaders recognize that there's an opportunity cost for nuclear weapons. If they believe they are under threat, and they are seriously under threat, and it's necessary to have them, they will make them. And they have demonstrated that they're prepared to do that. They're prepared to expand their nuclear capability and deploy nuclear weapons. However, if they cross that threshold, and they're very close to doing that, then there will certainly be costs, and they will not be able to pursue those other objectives of delivering economic recovery. They will be denied access to international financial institutions. They will not get those foreign technology transfers. They will not have access to foreign markets that they recognize and they are now telling their people are necessary for economic recovery. So this is why I remain optimistic. What is counterintuitive? Many critics will argue that any exchange, any economic exchange, any trade, any aid is fungible, and that it simply props up a corrupt and despicable regime, and that in fact any gains from economic exchanges can be transferred into weapons of mass destruction programs. So in the domestic politics of the U.S., it's very difficult to advocate any kind of economic exchange. But I believe it will be necessary, engagement in some kind of exchange will be necessary for North Korea to make that political decision, or for the leadership to have that political will. And the reason is that the people involved in those programs, the scientists, the engineers, the military people, are an important part of the leadership's coalition. So Kim Jong-il cannot simply get on the phone and say, hey, you guys, we're closing down the programs, go home now. He must provide some alternative employment or some kind of side payment to them, and that's going to be costly. And this is also counterintuitive in that it's also in our interest to do so, because if these guys, there are a lot of people employed in these programs, and in fact, when the delegation went there about a month ago, Dr. Hecker, the former director of Los Alamos National Laboratory, and Professor Lewis from Stanford, they went to the nuclear site, and one of the scientists told them, said, Dr. Hecker, we're very concerned about our jobs. And if the program were to be closed down, then they were concerned about their employment. And if these guys do not have alternative employment, they might end up in some other place like Pakistan or Syria or some other country that might be seeking the development of weapons of mass destruction. So that's why I remain optimistic. There are a lot of difficult details to work out. The talks that just ended on Saturday were inconclusive in many respects, but a good sign is that they decided to form working level groups to meet on a more regular basis and work on some of the difficult details. That's a necessary condition. It's not sufficient, though, but this was the second round of six-party talks, and if we only meet every 6 months, it'll take a couple hundred years at least to resolve this problem diplomatically. So I view this as a positive development, but we're not out of the woods yet. But I will stop it there, and we will entertain your questions. I guess you have to identify yourself, come up to the microphone, and we'll address your questions. Thank you.
No questions?
Good evening. I'm Kenton Bird. I teach in the School of Journalism and Mass Media here at the University of Idaho. And as you might expect, I'm curious about the role of the news media and individual journalists in promoting nonviolent political change, particularly in one-party states. And I'm wondering if we could bring Cuba into the discussion and have you assess the effectiveness of some of the U.S.-sponsored media initiatives like Radio Marti and TV Marti in terms of creating some political space for dissent in Cuba, and then perhaps across the world and assess whether the U.S. Could or should be supporting similar efforts aimed at the North Korean population, acknowledging the limitations of a closed society that doesn't have the same kind of media access that, say, Cuba does.
Well, it won't be a surprise for you to hear me say that I certainly believe that all possible methods of providing information to people living in closed societies should be used. The best indication of the interest of civilians inside such societies in the broadcasts of radio services like Radio Free Europe or I suppose Radio Marti. I'm not specifically familiar with how Radio Marti is received by the Cuban people, but is that most of these radio services are routinely jammed by the countries in which they are heard. That's a pretty good indication that there is some interest, particularly in the non-political programming, frankly. The Voice of America, affiliated with the Voice of America, is a radio service for Iranians, and on which I was interviewed with respect to the potential for nonviolent resistance inside Iran. Interestingly enough, that particular radio service was often jammed by Cuba on behalf of the Iranians, because the Cubans have the best radio jamming equipment in the world. And apparently, I'm not sufficiently familiar technically with how you do this, but apparently it's possible for equipment sitting in Cuba to jam a radio broadcast that's trying to emanate from North America and reach Iran. But I think, you know, to borrow a phrase from a closed society, let 1,000 flowers bloom. I'm not bothered that the United States government should try to beam its own radio programming into these countries. I suppose in the best of all possible worlds, I would prefer that international sources try to provide fair and unbiased programming. But, you know, the single most popular radio source anywhere in the world in an open or a closed society is the BBC. So factual, straight, informational, and cultural programming is absolutely popular everywhere you go, whether it's inside a closed society or not. And this is absolutely essential. If there are such initiatives that could be undertaken with respect to North Korea, if this is not already being done, I can't imagine that it would not be of assistance.
I would just add, in the North Korean case, the government fixes the radio stations and the television stations so they don't have to jam that much. They don't have the choice of the radio spectrum to scan. But the good news is that there are more exchanges between people. There are about 500 South Korean businessmen in Pyongyang now on a long-term basis. There was a connection of railroads and roads, and there are more exchanges of people. After the floods in the mid-90s, there was pretty much a breakdown in the security control of travel. People were allowed to go looking for food, and so there's more movement of people now. And another good point is that the government has targeted information technology as a strategic industry. And so they have a domestic network. They have an internet domain. They're not hooked up, but I've heard recently that National Assemblyman South Korea received email from North Korea, and they're getting out on dial-up through China. But of course, the average citizen does not have access to that. But we have to start somewhere. And so the traveling and the personal contacts, this is the way the information is flowing right now.
By the way, let me follow up and give you a hint about what may come in this field in the future. I am familiar with an effort to develop a device to make possible civilian-based radio broadcasting in any kind of society, closed or not, which would utilize off-the-shelf technology. This is underway right now. because of miniaturization, it is possible to combine self-inflating helium balloons with radio transmitter receivers that are no bigger than this and don't weigh as much, and mass produce these at the cost of $6 or $7 or $8 a unit. What would happen is that these units would be flooded into a country, thousands of them, available for members of an opposition inside a closed society. And each individual would be able to simply open this device up, send it aloft, and then broadcast with a microphone to this as it was aloft, hovering over a city for an hour or two, and pirate the state radio signal. And if this happened simultaneously, at the same time, week after week after week after week, it would drive any such regime absolutely nuts. It might even drive governments in the United States nuts, but it probably wouldn't be used for political purposes. It probably would be used for broadcasting music. But there are all kinds of things that can be done. I think that we're at the beginning of a wonderful era with respect to what I would call, the internet is obviously the first sign of this, with respect to what one might call civilian-based information media that don't require the mediation of large broadcast and news information distributing organizations. And that will certainly empower civilians in all kinds of societies.
Hi, my name is Ariana Dickinson. I'm a senior in international studies and German. And I wanted to go back to your point about these people needing to sort of give in to living a lie in order for the regime to work. And I wanted to, on one of your points for building a strong and powerful country, you said that the North Korean government believed in a strong indoctrination. Is that true for North Korea still? Is that something? Because it doesn't seem like a nonviolent action could happen until the people were no longer willing to live this lie.
Okay, what was the part about the strong and powerful country?
Right. Well, you had said that the government believed that the people were strongly indoctrinated, that it was a good government. And so I was wondering if that is still true today, if the people are still willing to go along with what the government is doing, or if they really are feeling sort of this movement away from the government.
Well, I think there are some paradoxes. In Korea, there's this force driving both halves towards a unity, and every Korean wants unification. But in South Korea now, this has changed over the past 10 or 15 years. There's a consensus that most people do not want a rapid German-style unification. They're willing to wait until there's some convergence and North Korea is able to recover economically. They don't want to absorb all the costs of that and the potential instability. And in North Korea, it seems to be accepted now that they have information about the standard of living. A lot of people have this information now. But a North Korean sitting there would think that, I think this is how they would view this. Yeah, things are bad. South Korea has a better standard of living, all of this. And yes, maybe it's a lie, but there's some fear or uncertainty because there are these regional antagonisms in Korea. And so most people would sit there and think, well, yeah, it's bad now, but if we reunify on South Korea's terms, then it's going to be even worse. Yeah, things are bad, but we've rebounded the past couple of years. Kim Jong-il says he's leading us out of backwardness, so he's, unveiling part of the lie, I guess. And so in that situation, for a good portion of the population, at least in the short term here, is to kind of cast their lot and give him a chance. So we will see. I think it's going to be a longer process and will be hopefully a nonviolent process. Personally, I would rather wait a little bit as opposed to have a violent upheaval. If there were a war in Korea, all-out, full-scale Korean war, the estimates are that in the first day or two, there'd be a couple 100,000 casualties. There would be between 1 and 2 million deaths. 100,000 or so U.S. servicemen and women's deaths, and the economic costs between about $1 and $2 trillion. So despite all of the gloomy facts that we discussed earlier, it could be much worse. But we have to keep working on this problem.
You know, the longer that it may take a long time to make it possible for ordinary civilians to fully see the disparity between not only their own conditions and conditions of people in neighboring countries or the outside, but also to grasp and to feel the enormous injustice that they live on a daily basis. When you feel material deprivation, there's no mistaking that. North Korea was afflicted for a protracted period of time by conditions of famine. No one experiencing famine is under any doubt that life is at a point of complete misery when their families and their communities are facing such devastation. But to connect that with a political awakening requires the ability to understand that something can be done, that it makes sense for the individual who previously has had no political power to take some kind of act to express opposition. And the opportunity, the knowledge that opposition can be undertaken without necessarily incurring a risk of immediate arrest and imprisonment, which is a possibility based on the selection of tactics and the strategy you have, even in a highly repressed society. Just that awakening, getting to that moment, is in some respects the most difficult phase in the inception and in the gestation of a civilian-based struggle. But there have been so many instances, as my colleague Peter Ackerman said last night, in which the conventional wisdom believed that nothing was possible against a regime until something occurred, and then after the fact people said, oh yes, well they had all these kinds of vulnerabilities that became visible to the outside world only after some action within the society began to break the ice and begin some degree of movement within the society. Now, I realize I'm talking theoretically. I'm not the North Korea expert, but I, like Dan, I am a very cautionary short-term, much more optimistic on a long-term basis. We may actually be right now in a unusual convergence or combination of circumstances in which, unlike Iraq, it seems highly unlikely that American military action vis-a-vis North Korea would take place unless the North Koreans did something really stupid and it were discoverable, like put a nuke on a ship and float it out in the general direction of a radical Muslim terrorist network. But assuming that were even discoverable, if something like that were attempted, then clearly some sort of military action, such as an embargo, might actually be resorted to by this administration. But assuming that is unlikely by virtue of the diplomatic track they seem to be on, and by virtue of what we've learned from Dan, which is that the regime may well be willing to trade its nuclear capability for significant economic benefits, that might actually buy time for civilians inside North Korea, assuming more information coming into the country in ways we've hinted at, to begin to experience that awakening and come to that moment that Havel described, so that there could be the inception of opposition actually inside the country. Cuba, in contrast, since we were supposed to talk about Cuba tonight as well, is a completely different situation, because even though the regime has been in power in Cuba for quite as long as the North Korean regime has been in, well, not quite as long as the North Korean regime has been in power, there's plenty of opposition to Castro inside Cuba. Only if you become a serious threat do you get arrested. There are, and I just read this earlier this week, much to my own surprise, 400 officially registered opposition groups in Cuba. So probably jazz pianists against Castro and whatever. But so there is an interesting stew of dissent that's not even quite so latent inside Cuba, which is obviously tolerated by the regime. So there are, and that's all to the good, because whatever you think of the Cuban regime, to the extent that the Cuban people themselves begin to assert their own rights, and there is support from abroad for that indigenous assertion of rights, whatever system develops in the future will be more likely to be expressive of those voices.
I'm Walter Hesford in English and American Studies. Many resistant groups, whether Gandhi's in India or Cesar Chavez in the United States, have tapped into religious roots of the people they wish to move and which move with them. I was wondering whether in North Korea and in Korea in general, there are religious traditions that can provide a kind of ground level support for resistance and for envisioning a different future.
Yes, that's a good question. During the Japanese colonial period, North Korea was the center of Christian missionaries in North Korea. Pyongyang was a big center there. In fact, I think Billy Graham's wife was born there. Her parents were missionaries there. And at the time of liberation, Reverend Joman Sheik was the main figure, nationalist figure. But over, from the late 40s and in the 50s, during the Korean War, these people were purged. There's also an indigenous religion called Chundogyo, which led rebellions against the monarchy in the late 19th century, this Eastern learning movement. And they have been, that's an opposition party that's been tolerated by the Korean Workers' Party. They have a few members in the Supreme People's Assembly, but basically they've been co-opted and are not really an opposition force. But we don't see the kind of, really a kind of religious networks that could provide the kind of, critical mass of opposition. At this point, there are a couple of churches and they're tolerated, but they don't really have that tradition right now. So it does not offer that opportunity, I don't see anyway.
Let me answer your question with respect to Cuba, which is a Catholic country, of course, as we know. There is sitting in Havana right now an archbishop who is extraordinarily sophisticated and certainly strongly pro-human rights and freely expressive of his position in that regard. Just as smart and just as supportive of human rights as Karol Wojtyla was in Krakow, in Poland, before he became Pope. And the Archbishop in Havana has been mentioned among the top 5 or 6 cardinals most likely to be selected as the next Pope. I'm not making a prediction, but I'm telling you what I've read and what I know. The Catholic Church has served in some countries that have been governed by autocratic rulers it has served as a protective space. It has offered protective space to dissidents. Jaime Cardinal Sin in the Philippines played a very important role in helping to legitimate the people power movement in that country against Ferdinand Marcos. The church in Chile played an equally important role in nurturing and protecting during the really hard years of the Pinochet regime opposition to the military junta in Chile. In contrast, the church in Argentina did not notably help in any way the oppositionists to the military, successive military rulers of Argentina during the terror years in the 1970s. So it's not an unmixed record with respect to Christian churches, particularly the Catholic Church, being of assistance. The movement against the East German regime in 1988, 1989 was given great impetus by Protestant churches in East Germany. And many of the marches, the candlelight marches, which became bigger and bigger and bigger in the weeks and months leading up to the change in East Germany, began in church basements. So there is certainly a work, and the reason for this is that in most of these societies, these regimes don't want trouble with churches. And they don't want trouble with churches because they don't want to exacerbate or inflame opposition on a basis other than politics. So that's why, for example, the Catholic Church had tremendously protected space in Poland and was a vital part of fueling the rise of what became solidarity in Poland. There's no question that without the Catholic Church, I might even go so far as to say there might not even have been a solidarity movement in Poland. So, but the point here is not so much that individuals feel some special religious impulse and then act on that religious impulse to join a nonviolent movement. It's that the expression of that kind of a sentiment and opposition that is in part assisted by religious institutions which are able to persist in oppressive societies because the regime doesn't want to go after the religion, that can offer really precious space and important resources to people who ultimately have a political agenda.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Sanders. Some popular resistance movements use violent strategies and others don't. And I wonder what factors you might choose to identify that play a role in the decision whether or not to be a nonviolent movement.
I don't know of a single instance in which leaders of a political opposition, underground or in a covert situation, in a nascent situation, in an oppressed society, have sat around idly debating the choice between nonviolent or violent struggle, at least not in academic terms. Usually violent opposition organizations, oppositionists who are prepared to be violent under certain circumstances are prepared to be violent because they think that that's the most propulsive form of change, that the only way that a particularly odious oppressor or adversary can be confronted is with violence. Some months ago, we had sitting in our offices a very smart and well-motivated and young Palestinian man who is part of the nonviolent resistance to the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. And he said, well, you know, we really have two struggles inside our country. We have a struggle with the Israelis, but we also have a struggle with those of us who are bound and determined to use violence against the Israelis. And when we explain, you know, everything that we've learned from your materials and your ideas and other sources of information about nonviolent resistance, when we explain the kind of strategy to them that we know would work if it were only taken up by the vast majority of Palestinians, he says we always get this same line back, well, the only thing the Israelis understand is violence. How can you ask us to be nonviolent when the Israelis are so violent against us? And I told him, well, the next time you hear someone say to you, the only thing the Israelis understand is violence, you should just stipulate his position and say, okay, exactly. Why should we do what they're doing? How will we ever become more proficient at the use of violence than an occupying military force can be against us? It doesn't make any sense. But in fact, there are very few instances in which a strategy relying on violence is strategically sound. If your adversary is well armed and is a and is institutionalized in the form of a government. There have been successful violent uprisings, but they haven't led to stable, open societies where human rights are honored.
I'm Chandler Preby. I'm interested in knowing what your comments or thoughts are a few years from now in Korea. You referred to a wealthy society at the upper level of the North Korean society, and you had technicians such as the chemists and the lab people working in the nuclear industry. Are these going to be the catalysts for a middle-class society that can make a change, and what would cause them to change the government of North Korea?
Well, some people believe that with rising economic prosperity, it increases the political expectations, and as people become more affluent, they expect greater political participation. And then the state has this, if they want to maintain one-party rule or maintain authoritarian system, they have to make choices, and at some point it might be difficult to maintain that control. We've seen that in a number of countries. There have been a number of examples. But then there are countries where we see where it has not happened, and China is one case, although there's been some slow movement. One of the good things about North Korea, even when I was in graduate school in the early 90s, and I looked at the problems, and I thought, this is not sustainable. And one of my professors, my advisors, he was an economist, and he said, no, the good news is that the policy mix is so bad. There's only one way to go but up. They don't need brilliant policy. They can just do some simple things and get improvement and get the ball rolling. I mean, they said the same thing about South Korea 40 years ago. People used to talk about US aid as being throwing money down the rat hole. And it was one of the poorest countries in the world, and everyone thought there was no way South Korea could become developed. So I think all countries can do that. North Korea can do that. They have an educated population, which is your most important thing is human resources. So they have some advantages there. I just believe it's not sustainable. And it even becomes in the leaders' interest to give up that control as your economy grows and you have a more sophisticated society and more productive processes and all of this. It just becomes difficult to micromanage that and control everything. I'm pretty confident about it and optimistic about it in the long run. But yeah, we have to look at some very grim human rights problems and so forth in the short term.
Thank you for the wealth of information you shared with us. I have a question. With all the work that you do with resistance groups across the world, and I didn't hear anything about at home, especially at the time of a Patriot Act period, does your position in helping those resistant groups put you at odds with what our government here wants to accomplish or wants to do, especially, for example, we heard about the president's restriction or on Cuban companies that try to promote tourism to Cuba. During that same period, we had, I'm not sure whether some of our congressmen in Cuba trying to negotiate trade deals. If it was Walter here, probably he'll be in prison now. Maybe not. So I just want to see how do you work with rules and regulations that we have existing here as you communicate across the globe? Thanks.
I'm not sure that there is anyone in the U.S. government at the moment outside the U.S. Institute of Peace who appreciates the potential impact of the strategic use of civilian-based struggle in closed societies to open up those societies. There certainly are some countries governed by authoritarian rulers that the United States government has an active interest in changing. There are other countries governed by authoritarian rulers which it appears the U.S. government has no interest in changing in any way. We don't discriminate. If it's a non-democratic system in which the government is abusing human rights, we will help get tools and resources in strategic civilian-based resistance to legitimate indigenous civilian groups in those societies, which are committed to nonviolent action, period. So far, what we have done, and we've only been in existence 3 years thus far, has not, to the best of my knowledge, gotten anyone's noses out of joint, but that's probably because they're unaware of what we're doing, not because they wouldn't be, we have not thus far, for example, been approached by Saudis or Egyptians but let me tell you where the conflict of interest between, shall we say, people in the West who want to assist civilian-based groups which at least want to liberalize the observance of human rights in oppressed societies and the interests of Western governments and other kinds of Western interests, and that's in Central Asia. There are governments in Central Asia which are unpleasant, and yet there are strategic alliances being formed for economic and other purposes, strategic purposes supposedly, with those governments. Long term, that's as unsustainable as American support for Ferdinand Marcos was in the Philippines. And I could cite other examples. But we certainly are not going to refrain from providing assistance if we are asked in the form of tools. Keep in mind, the assistance we give is not money, not cash, and not material support, but ideas, skills, intellectual tools and resources, if you will, which is absolutely the most important form of tools and resources that you can give to people who want to resist and use their own abilities within their own societies. But we're not going to refrain from providing that support simply because to do so might discomfit some people in a particular administration, this one or a succeeding administration. We have to be consistent and true to our own mission. There was also an aspect to your question I'm not sure I answered having to do with Cuba.
It was just an example. I can't remember when was Congressman Arthur and Craig and I think someone else were visiting in Cuba trying to negotiate or talk about trade agreements. And during that same period, President Bush announced that certain Cuban companies, who promote tourism to Cuba, their finances will be withheld and such. So there were two opposite perspectives at work there.
I think it's true enough to say that there has been an historical inconsistency in U.S. foreign policy in its dealings, in the government's dealings with private organizations which wish to stimulate citizen-to-citizen exchanges in simply communist regimes. As we know, the Eisenhower administration began cultural exchanges with the Soviet Union on the theory that it would be wise to let some steam out of the Cold War conflict, and also with the belief that there would be individuals within Soviet society who would be interested in learning about Western ideas, and somehow this would. There's no indication that there is some evidence to suggest that those programs were very, very helpful long-term in the change which occurred in the Soviet Union. They were by no means the decisive factor, but they certainly didn't hurt. And if the United States had refused to do that, I don't think anyone would suggest that the refusal to do that would have in any way damaged the position, of the Soviet state. So it's hard for me to imagine how such programs with Cuba, how suspending such programs with Cuba would damage the Cuban government, or why the implementation of such programs could not at least, in a marginal way, contribute to the kinds of exchanges, the flow of human information back and forth, which could help eventually to open up the society further than it is at the moment.
Hi, my name is Jim Franklin. And I guess the first statement was just you were speaking about what mistakes North Korea could make to cause United States intervention. Let's hope they also don't find a large oil field and have the United States going in there. My question really comes to the open world dialogue, though. And we saw a lot of this with Iraq. And we had the world coming in and speaking together. But there's been very little of it that's been spoken of between the situation between North Korea and the United States. How would you see a dialogue being really opening up to the world to diffuse the situation between the United States and North Korea? And what is it within North Korea that has that resistance to wanting that outside influence? You did mention some regional influence that's occurring now with these meetings, but on a global scale, how do you think we could diffuse that down from just being the U.S. against North Korea?
Well, it depends how you view the problem. From the North Korean perspective, they believe they are under threat from the United States and that they need negative security assurances, and that can only come from the United States, most powerful country in the world. I'm not sure that's true, and it doesn't really matter what I think or what anyone else here thinks, but it really matters what they think, because that's what's driving their behavior. And if you look historically, they were under threat of nuclear weapons during the Korean War. We were developing our nuclear doctrine at that time. They were new weapons. We had recently used them against Japan, and there were some advocates for their use in the U.S. at that time. They used propaganda and so forth and studied the psychological effects, used practice bombing runs. Douglas MacArthur asked for nuclear weapons he wanted to use against North Korea and China. The U.S. deployed nuclear weapons there. They believed they were under nuclear threat for some time, and that's when they began to develop nuclear weapons. So the motivations are very complex, and they have a very acute security problem because the country's divided. The role of the U.S. is very important from North Korean perspective, but for most people in the U.S., policymakers in D.C., it's not that important other than their WMD programs. If they didn't have WMD programs, they would really be irrelevant. We don't have economic ties or anything else. So from North Korean perspective, there has to be some end to this hostile relationship that we've had for half a century. Others believe that solving the problem requires putting more pressure on North Korea. And if you want to apply more pressure, then you build up a multilateral coalition and gather your resources and direct the resources of that coalition against North Korea. That will work at some point, I guess, but we don't really know where the breaking point is. And I argue that they will have deployed a number of nuclear weapons and will accelerate their program long before we get to that point. So that's the problem. And with the Cold War being over, I think there are opportunities. It's not so important. And the U.S., I think, can be a little more confident being a superpower and so forth. The reality is we have to make some concessions or grant some kind of security assurance. I think that's part of the a necessary component to solving the problem.
You sometimes hear, well, you can't deal with North Korea because the beloved leader is just crazy, and I mean, because the same thing was said of Gaddafi until a few months ago, and when he becomes our friend, and certainly is said of Saddam Hussein. But I just wonder if you could comment on that, that you would have personal knowledge of his mental health. But this perception, I think it's perpetrated on media that Well, dealing with these people is like dealing with the irrational, and so why be rational?
Yeah, there's the media in the West really demonize him, and he looks funny, and he wears these jumpsuits like Jack LaLanne wears, and so people think he's really strange. I really admire him for that. I mean, if I could be a head of state and not have to put on a suit and tie and walk around in a sweatsuit all the time, that would be great. I'd be very comfortable. But I think most of those rumors and suggestions that he's crazy or irrational have pretty much been laid to rest. During the authoritarian period in South Korea, it was originally called the Korean CIA, and then the Agency for National Security Planning. Now the name's been changed into the National Intelligence Service. The intelligence agency in South Korea disseminated a lot of information, some wrong information about Kim Jong-il, that he was crazy or drunk, or walked around with, burning cigarettes in the furniture and things like this, and so forth. But that's not, it's not true. The guy's rational. He's very smart. I haven't had the chance to meet him, but I've spoken with people who have, and they're very impressed. He's very well briefed and informed, and he works very hard. He likes to work at night. There's a good biography that came out on him just recently on Kim Jong-il. It was written by Michael Breen. And you should take a look at that, and has a lot of insights. And some of the quirks and things about his behavior, it's not that different from any East Asian businessman who, back in his days would drink a little bit or have some wild parties or something like that. So I don't buy that he's irrational.
Let me also answer your question on a broader level, having to do with the mindset of the authoritarian central figure, because that is relevant to understanding the final phase of how these regimes implode. Such individuals, particularly when they hold power for a long period of time, seem liable to certain behavioral traits which don't necessarily make them astute decision makers when faced by a civilian resistance movement when it actually obtains traction and becomes an adversary and a threat to the life of a regime. And such traits, I'm not necessarily saying these apply to Kim Il-jung, but such traits usually flow from the insulation of these figures from contact with as large a network of people with whom most national leaders are in touch in today's world. Another such trait is becoming inured over a long period of time, desensitized, if you will, to the effect of decisions which involve killing large numbers of people. There is a further narrowing of the perspective on themselves. There's almost, in my view, based on all the literature I've read, a certain infantilization that takes place with the individual, a kind of detachment, not from the ability to make smart decisions based on objective information presented to them in the form of a brief memorandum or in a meeting or in an official exchange, but an inability to see phenomena which would impress you or I, because we have a fuller range of human contact in an open society, and because we don't live in a highly cosseted and protected environment in which our every whim is honored and our word may be feared. Fear of the oppressive central figure by people within the regime itself can lead to a interruption of a full diet of information flowing to that ruler. What we now know is that if a number of those who have been interviewed who are part of the Iraqi regime are to be believed, Saddam was led to believe that by his own people at the second and third echelon that the regime held more in the way of stocks of weapons of mass destruction than in fact it did, because they didn't want to tell him how they had built down those stocks in order to escape either UN inspections earlier on in the 90s or because the people at the second and third echelon saw opportunities to make money and pocketed money that otherwise would have gone into doing what they told Saddam was being done. And by virtue of the degree of isolation, in some cases a self-isolation, an inability in the way in which the inner core is structured to allow full information to flow to the central decision maker, which then could lead to, in a crisis, bad decisions by that central figure. What I'm trying to describe is, in a certain sense, the parapsychology of authoritarian leaders as a regime decays. And regime decay is not just a question of personal corruption. That can accrue because individuals in that regime are liable to cut deals for themselves and be willing to be paid off and all the rest. But it's also a decay of what one might call, what one might suggest is the discipline that a team of people who work together must necessarily have if the quality of corporate decisions is going to remain consistent. I have not read about or studied an authoritarian regime that's eventually come a cropper because of civilian resistance where some pattern along those lines hasn't in fact been the case. The only thing that put me in mind of this with respect to Kim Il-jung, which is totally anecdotal, was I read an article in the New York Times Magazine based on interviews with a former personal chef of Kim Il-jung, who had apparently succeeded in being his personal chef for longer than any previous personal chef, but had eventually defected successfully. He immensely enjoyed cooking for Kim Il-jung. He freely admitted for years and years because Kim Il-jung had a highly developed palate and showed his exuberance and enthusiasm for the creations of this chef, the most appreciative celebrity that he had ever cooked for, ever. And his creations were so good that he got a very long leash. And he liked to take trips to Japan, and Kim Il-jung would personally allow him to go to Japan to pick up types of sea urchins to be cooked that were extremely rare. And finally, after a number of years, the chef decided he'd had it. He was out of, he passed the point of diminishing returns. He was no longer amused by Kim Il-jung. He thought if he was such a great chef, he could take his talent somewhere else. So he found in an encyclopedia some sea urchin, that could only be had in a certain, and he went to the great leader and said, I found a new sea urchin. He said, well, tell me about the sea urchin, and he tells him about the sea urchin. And he says, but he says, you can only catch it in the morning on a certain island, So Kim Il-jung sets up a private jet for him to take him to this Japanese island, and he never comes back. But so this sea urchin obsession of Kim Il-jung, and that lost him one chef at that point. That I don't know that that's exactly an example of what I was trying to suggest about authoritarian rulers, but they may not be crazy in the conventional sense of the word, and they may make good decisions about all kinds of objective things, but there are certain conditions which are most bizarre that usually set in and that degrade the quality of decisions, at least in the final phase of the lives of these regimes.
Yeah, I'm Mark Anderson. I'm a doctoral student here in political science. My question had to do with media. Yesterday we talked about, last night, about 1904, 1905, the failed Russian Revolution, and then later ones with Gandhi, successful. And then my question has to do with how it intensifies and it quickens the pace that possibly these authoritarian regimes are more vulnerable with media, transparency, and even the fact that maybe Western culture comes in. I mean, Baywatch is the most watched show in the whole world. I'm not saying that's great, bad, or what. And McDonald's and Coca-Cola and all that it's kind of hard to hide all these other things if you're in a totalitarian regime. How does that affect your equation? Does it accelerate the pace of deterioration? People getting up and seeing there are other things to do, wanting to be able to change it in a nonviolent manner?
Well, yes, but to the extent that exposure to what's going on elsewhere in culture and in society and in political life elsewhere in the region of a country or in the world as a whole sharpens the contradiction felt by the individual citizen between the reality of the life they face and the opportunities that they feel might come to them if the society were more open, if the system were arranged differently. I think that is a helpful, I don't know that it's an absolutely essential prerequisite for a resistance movement to be successful, but can it be a contributing factor? Yes, I think it can be a contributing factor. I think that more important is the kind of contradiction in a society which forces those who don't believe they have anything much to lose to go into a state first of mental opposition, followed by taking acts, hopefully in concert with others, hopefully in a strategic way, which is where we may come in, to express that opposition and to begin a movement to actually effectuate some form of change. That requires at least the imagination to believe that change is possible, if not actual information that change has taken place in other societies. My colleague Peter Ackerman is very enthusiastic about telling the story, I believe he may even mention this last night, of the Serb students who sparked the 2000 events which brought down Milosevic, who, after Milosevic had fallen, finally saw A Force More Powerful, the television series, and said that they'd seen the Chilean segment a few years before. That would have given them all the impetus they needed to believe they could have brought down Milosevic, and there would never have been ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. I think any of those who were here last night may have heard Peter say that. Imagination has to be fired about what's possible. And then there also has to be some sharp felt contradiction, some internal angst, some refusal to take it anymore, some belief that life is never going to be normal. I can't get out of here, so I'm going to do something about this. Most of these societies suffer enormous emigration and refugee outflows. Refugee outflows if there are crises, brain drains at a minimum. Serbia suffered such an outflow, primarily of young people for a long period of time before the change in 2000. If that safety valve is not available, or if it's just not satisfactory to some people for whatever reason, there needs to be that internal switch that goes from the off to the on position. I'm not sure that that requires watching Baywatch, but I think it takes more a point of having reached an internal psychological exhaustion point for the individual civilian, and therefore, and among that group which is feeling that, those who are natural risk takers, I'm sure there are even some in this room, dwindling audience though it is, to be willing to say to themselves, something has to be done. And I am willing to be one of the people who begins that action. So I think that is more important than the generalized exposure to culture from the outside. And as you know, in some societies, too much Baywatch can have the opposite effect.
Let me give you just a short contrarian view just for the heck of it as a devil's advocate. And if you're a doctoral student, maybe you've read, in political science, maybe you've read some Alexander Gerschenkron, who postulated that late developing countries have an advantage. You can collapse the developmental time frame because you can copy what other countries did and you can take technology off the shelf. Now, as a late reformer, maybe North Korea has some advantages. Now, some people said this was simply because of Kim Jong-il's quirks or his strange, irrational behavior, but he took a train across the former Soviet Union, across Russia when he went to Moscow. The reason he did this was to conduct a tour of what had happened in Russia after their reform process and everything. He's been to China. He went back to Shanghai stock market a second day and was chastising his officials. Why don't we have things like this? And looking at the development and so forth. So as a late reformer, he can look at what's happened in China, what happened in Russia and so forth, these other countries, these other cases. And then you look at the population and what their reference point is. They don't need the spectacular, they're not going to be disappointed if they're not recording spectacular growth rates like some countries have done, but they're looking at their own experience over the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And if things are turning around, which they seem to be now, then the leadership can take credit for that. And so they can manipulate the media in a way that they can take advantage and get all the credit. So it's kind of a mixed bag. There's some uncertainty there, whether or not it's going to accelerate this process or who gets credit for reform. And as the Chinese have shown, if you can keep delivering the economic goods and keep, high growth rates and everyone's standard of living is improving, one-party state can take credit for that. But when you have some declining, then suddenly if you have some declining economic performance, then you can, have some instability.
Well, I would simply argue, let me make one more comment if I might. I'm sorry, before your question, sir. I don't buy the idea that economic misery or decline is a necessary precondition for a politically motivated resistance to gain traction. There are too many instances that I've seen in history in which even in the absence of severe economic distress, there can be substantial distress with the effects of deprivation of human rights. China's very large, and while it's true that while it appears to be true that the greater number of the Chinese people have hope by virtue of economic improvement and change in the terms of their own lives, and even the ability to access information from the outside world to a much larger extent than was the case 10 or goodness knows 20 years ago. There are large groups within China whose rights are systematically suppressed. Religious minorities, ethnic minorities, Muslims in the West, Tibetans in the South, other ethnic minorities inside China. There are also occupational categories now, people in certain occupational categories who are most well aware of the fact that they have fewer privileges and fewer opportunities than others. My argument is simply that the perception that one's fundamental rights are denied in relation to the rights of others, that their injustice, the feeling of injustice, does not require a declining standard of living to stimulate opposition among those for whom that is an essential part of being human. And my argument would simply be that to be able to express yourself, to be able to have a say in the way your life is ordered, is a fundamental human impulse, and that's present everywhere. And that if that is denied systematically for a long enough period of time, if there are groups in that society who suffer that kind of deprivation, there will eventually be consequences for the political system of a disruptive nature.
I think we could probably go on all night, but I think we've been told we need to...
Can I have one more question, please, Sandy?
Pardon?
Can I have one more question?
Well, I think I need to cut it off. If you could maybe address your question to them individually after we're done, but at this point, it's 9 o'clock and we've had our 2 hours, so I'm sorry. But if you come up and talk to them individually, I'm sure they'd be glad to. I'd just like to say, Jack Duvall and Dan Pinkston, thank you very much for sharing your expertise on nonviolent conflict with us tonight. And I'll just remind you, we have 2 more Borah Symposium events tomorrow, a community forum at noon, and then our keynote speaker tomorrow night. It is at 7. Some of the information that's out is wrong, but it is at 7 o'clock tomorrow night. And I know that the Book People bookstore had some of Jack Duvall's books out front. I don't know if they're still out there this late at night, but you can check.
Well, you bet. It was
Thank
good.
you.
I enjoyed the events. I learned a lot.
Yeah, I did as well. Thanks.